Homework for day 22, events of the mammalian reproductive cycle from early follicles to ovulation. Pretty much straight from the videos. I'm just going to run you through some of the ways you could represent it with some students who I thought did a good job. So GnRH neurons up here, and they're releasing GnRH. Receptors on cells are producing either LH, and that's these pluses. So they're producing LH, or they're producing FSH, these triangles, and releasing them into capillaries to be carried down to the heart and then eventually to the ovary. These cells are in the anterior pituitary, so this is the base of the brain. The whole brain would go up here. So these cells are releasing them at the base of the hypothalamus, and then here's the pituitary with the anterior pituitary right there. This person made a note that FSH causes gametogenesis in both males and females, so sperm production and then development of the ova in females, whereas LH in both causes sex steroid secretion. Estrogens predominantly in males, progesterone predominantly in females, though both sexes produce both, and they both have functions in both sexes. Here is another example. Oh, sorry, here's more of the same example. This one is, now this part of it is showing, let me zoom in here. This is showing the effect of estrogen on KISS-negative neurons here and KISS-positive neurons. I want to make the point that both of these, when they release kisspeptin always causes action potentials and GnRH release in GnRH neurons. Okay. So when we say KISS-negative, what we refer to is the negative feedback going on. So estrogen binding to these receptors, that triggers events that cause potassium channels, or it could be chloride channels. In any case, something inhibitory. Potassium leaves, so we get less or fewer APs. So fewer APs, so some of the GnRH that would have otherwise been released isn't. So with less kisspeptin, you have fewer action potentials. So higher estrogen causes fewer action potentials, less kisspeptin. So high estrogen, less kisspeptin, less GnRH. Okay. So that's what we mean by negative. It's inhibitory, negative feedback. And then at the time of the LH surge, high estrogen is now enough to bind to these fewer receptors here and cause action potentials in these cells. So now we have the kisspeptin from these cells plus these cells. In addition, these cells secrete a lot of kisspeptin, so they start causing positive feedback. So more kisspeptin leads to more GnRH, which leads to more LH, which leads to more LH, which leads to more estrogen, which feeds back, so you have even more kisspeptin, even more GnRH, even more LH, even more estrogen, even more kisspeptin, even more GnRH, and so on for an LH surge. So that's shown here with the GnRH declining over time because we keep getting more and more estrogen. So this estrogen is giving negative feedback that keeps pushing this down. More estrogen, you push it down more. And that is also causing LH to decrease. Now this is a bit of an oversimplification. If you look at figures with these graphs, I'm oversimplifying because it's actually not just the amount of LH, it's surges. LH is normally secreted in surges. And so it's how frequent the surges are. But a good proxy is just saying less and less LH, and you don't need to worry about it. Anyway, when we get to the surge, we now have enough estrogen. This is the threshold for the KISS-positive cells. So that causes, that estrogen causes kisspeptin to start causing more GnRH, which causes more LH, more estrogen, and so on in this positive feedback loop. So we get a GnRH surge, an LH surge, and that LH surge is what triggers ovulation. So of course that can't happen unless the ovum is really big. So let's zoom in here. So when we have a small follicle, we've got FSH that is triggering cell division and all these cells around the outside. And LH is triggering estrogen secretion from those cells. Now, when you only have a few cells, you only get a little bit of estrogen. As you get more and more and more cells, you get more estrogen, and finally, when you've got this big ovum ready to go, you get a really large amount of estrogen. And this is what triggers positive feedback. So that doesn't happen until the ovum is big and ready to be ovulated. So when it's big enough, all these cells trigger estrogen, you get the positive feedback cycle that gives the LH surge, and the LH surge triggers breakdown of this, and away goes our ovum ready to be fertilized. So here's the LH surge, here's the ovum, here's the ovum traveling down the oviduct, here it is. And the LH surge also in most mammals triggers mating behaviors. And so the mating behaviors would trigger mating and sperm coming up to meet it. Of course, they'd be really tiny in comparison to that ovum. And the second point is that the increasing amounts of estrogen over time have caused cell division. And so the uterine lining, which was really thin, has gotten thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker, and getting ready for the embryo to bind. Same events that are triggering some of the that are triggering ovulation often also trigger putting the receptors on these outermost cells so that the ovum can bind. So that surface receptors on the fertilized embryo at that point can bind to the uterus. Okay, question 2 was about events during pregnancy. And so now we're looking at, here's the LH surge has happened for GnRH over here. So this is the LH surge, here's LH. And at the end of the LH surge, we've gone down in all these hormones because progesterone has risen. So progesterone here has risen. And that's being produced by these leftover follicles, the corpus luteum. The ovum is long gone, but the leftover follicles have switched over from producing estrogen to progesterone. That progesterone is coming from, here's the let's see here, that's chorionic gonadotropin. So the progesterone is being produced because the embryo here, there are cells of the embryo inside, and then there are the developing extra embryonic membranes around the outside, and some of them, the part of the chorion and the allantois, just digest their way into the uterine lining. So the allantois and then the chorion outermost protective, and the allantois underneath it with blood vessels that are going to be taking blood from the heart into the placenta and back. So these support cells are producing chorionic gonadotropin. Chorionic gonadotropin is a message that that there's a pregnancy. It's basically a little message yelling, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Keep me, keep me. And that CG is causing progesterone secretion. So chorionic gonadotropin gets into the blood, gets to the ovary, and it triggers progesterone. So as long as that embryo is there, it's going to keep producing chorionic gonadotropin. If the embryo dies, we'll stop having chorionic gonadotropin, and that will stop production of progesterone, and the uterine lining will either be reabsorbed in most mammals or shed in a human, and that would be the end. And then the mammal would be ready for a new pregnancy. And let's see here. Here, the last piece. Here is fertilization, which wasn't actually part of the question, but a good thing I do want you to know it. So we've got a successful sperm. There are sperm egg recognition proteins. I think the egg recognition protein is actually a G protein coupled receptor. Anyway, the sperm binds, digests its way through this outer covering. The binding to that sperm binding protein of the egg, that G protein coupled receptor, triggers a second messenger pathway. You could use any of the ones we talked about. The actual one is, I think, an osteophosphate, but we don't really care. But in any case, it opens calcium channels. Those calcium channels then bind to calcium binding proteins, and they trigger fusion of these what are called cortical granules, these vesicles really, and they're releasing molecules like GAGs, highly hydrophilic molecules that once they're exposed to water, they swell up tremendously and they create a barrier that other sperm can't get through. And the nucleus of this sperm winds up inside the ovum along with its mitotic spindle, and that can start the process of development. And here's another one showing, again, the sperm, GAGs or GAG-like molecules. And this is the calcium coming in after binding to its receptor. So calcium's coming in through this channel, and the calcium is then binding to calcium binding proteins, causing release of these GAGs and GAG-like molecules, which swell tremendously with water. Over here, the corpus luteum switching to progesterone. High progesterone has negative feedback. It acts on those same kisspeptin cells, and it causes them to reduce the amount of kisspeptin to GnRH neurons, and so we have low GnRH, no new follicles. That's important because we don't want to start a new pregnancy while we've got one going. Here is the embryo showing chorionic gonadotropin here being produced. Chorionic gonadotropin binding to receptors in the corpus luteum, causing the progesterone secretion, and that progesterone is also maintaining the uterine lining here. I just wanted to show you another one that includes some of the same things. Here's the brain. Here are the KISS-negative cells showing estrogen receptors allowing potassium out, inhibiting them, whereas the KISS-positive cells, when there's enough estrogen to activate the relatively slow number of receptors, we get sodium in. And so KISS-positive cells would cause more GnRH with more estrogen for positive feedback. Here is LH and FSH. Here's the ovary and the effects of both, and the effects of estrogen to increase uterine lining. Here's number 2, showing in a way that is hard for me to explain here because it's all over the place, but it has everything in it. This is showing LH binding to the ovary wall and digesting its way through, which lets the ovum out. And here's the ovum meeting a sperm. Here's the embryo right in here, and it's producing chorionic gonadotropin that is going to the corpus luteum, which is causing it to produce progesterone and maintain the uterine lining, and it would also be inhibiting new follicles from growing. Some stuff about the embryo itself. Here are events of fertilization.